The morning of my wedding was a blur. You'd think the happiest day of your life would stand out in your memory, vivid and unforgettable, but all I can remember is a flurry of nerves and excitement. It wasn't just the usual pre-wedding jitters. There was something else, a lingering unease I couldn't quite shake off. Maybe it was because the wedding was everything Olivia, my fiancée, had ever dreamed of, and I felt a strange, gnawing pressure to make sure it went perfectly. The whole thing was a grand spectacle, elegant floral arrangements, a string quartet playing softly in the background, and the whole town of Rockwell buzzing with excitement. When Olivia walked down the aisle, her smile glowed as she moved toward me, her white dress flowing like water over polished stone. As she stood beside me, her hand in mine, I swore I saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, a strange tension, but I brushed it off as my nerves. It was just the weight of the moment, right? The ceremony was beautiful, with vows whispered softly, hands clasped tightly, and Olivia gazing up at me like I was her whole world. She looked so happy, so genuinely in love, that I couldn't help but feel foolish for having any doubts. By the time we exchanged rings, I'd managed to push all my unease down, telling myself that this was what I had always wanted. After the ceremony, we moved to the reception hall. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses filled the air as family and friends gathered to celebrate. Olivia was the picture of joy, gliding through the room like she owned it. She chatted with guests, her laughter echoing through the hall as she accepted countless congratulations. I tried to stay by her side, but she seemed to have this natural energy pulling her in every direction. I didn't mind. I was used to her being the life of every event, but every now and then, I noticed her eyes darting around the room, her focus drifting as if she was searching for something, or someone. When it was time for our first dance, she was already glowing from the wine and the excitement, and she twirled in my arms as if we were the only two people in the world. Yet, there was a brief moment when I saw her expression change, a quick flash, almost like she was a million miles away. Before I could even process it, her radiant smile was back, and I laughed it off as wedding jitters. But things started to feel strange as the night wore on. Somewhere between toasts, the dinner, and endless small talk, I lost track of Olivia. At first, I thought she might have been caught up with guests or making her rounds. But when an hour had passed and I hadn't seen her, a quiet anxiety started gnawing at me. I searched the crowded hall, but there was no sign of her, and my attempts to ask around only met with vague answers. "Oh, I just saw her a moment ago," someone said, laughing off my concerns. That's when I stepped outside, hoping maybe she was catching a breath or slipping away to fix her makeup in the quiet. The cool night air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and roses, the world outside feeling calm and undisturbed. The chatter from inside faded as I walked around the corner of the building. And then, I heard hushed voices coming from behind the garden wall. At first, it didn't register. My mind wasn't even trying to piece together what I was hearing because it seemed so absurd, so wrong. But then I recognized her voice. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs as I peered around the wall, my mind racing with the hope that there was some innocent explanation. What I saw shattered that hope in an instant. Olivia was there, pressed close to a man I didn't recognize, their heads bent together in a way that could only be described as intimate. My heart dropped, a sickening wave of realization crashing over me as I watched. She was laughing softly, her hand resting on his shoulder, and the look in her eyes was something I hadn't seen all day, a raw, undisguised longing. I stumbled back, feeling like the world had just caved in around me. I ducked back behind the wall, clutching my chest as if I could keep my heart from shattering. The happy, celebratory atmosphere of the reception hall suddenly felt a world away, and I was left standing there, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I took a few steadying breaths, but no amount of deep breathing could erase the image of Olivia with that stranger. It was surreal. My mind reeled, searching for logical explanations. Maybe it was a long-lost friend, or maybe she'd had too much to drink. But no amount of mental gymnastics could justify the way they looked at each other, a closeness that had no place at our wedding. The first thought that surfaced in my mind was to confront her, but the anger surging through me was tempered by a gnawing uncertainty. So, instead, I just waited. I pressed myself against the wall, hoping to catch any words they might exchange, but their whispers were too low to make out. Then, just as quickly as they'd vanished, the voices stopped, and the sounds of footsteps moved away toward the garden exit. I didn't dare peek around the wall until I was certain they were gone. When I finally gathered the courage, I walked around the corner to see Olivia standing alone by the garden fountain, adjusting her hair and taking deep breaths. She didn't see me approach, and I stayed just out of sight, watching as she pulled out her phone and typed something quickly. Then, she straightened her dress, smoothed her hair one last time, and walked back toward the reception hall. I couldn't bring myself to follow her. Instead, I leaned against the cold stone wall, a hurricane of emotions tearing through me. Anger, hurt, disbelief, and a dawning realization that the woman I'd just married, the woman who I thought was everything I could ever want, might be hiding things I'd never even considered. Eventually, I made my way back inside. I saw her across the room, her eyes bright and laughter easy as she chatted with our guests. She spotted me and gave me a dazzling smile, motioning for me to join her. The sight of her standing there, looking so happy and perfect, felt like a slap in the face. I walked up to her, trying to keep my expression neutral. She took my hand, beaming up at me as though we hadn't just been miles apart, physically and in every other way that mattered. "There you are. I was starting to wonder where you'd gone," she laughed, pulling me in closer. Her touch felt foreign, a reminder of just how recently she'd been touching someone else. I kept my voice steady, careful not to show the storm brewing inside me. "Just needed some air." "It's a big day," I replied, trying to keep things casual. Her eyes softened, and she leaned her head against my shoulder. "I know. Can you believe we're finally married?" The words stung. I didn't even know how to respond, so I just gave a noncommittal hum. For a second, I felt the urge to shake her, to demand answers right here in front of everyone. But I knew better than to cause a scene. This was my family, my friends, and if nothing else, I wanted to handle this with dignity, even if I didn't know what exactly I was handling yet. The night wore on painfully slowly. Olivia and I went through the motions, cutting the cake, listening to speeches, sharing our first dance as husband and wife. To everyone around us, we must have looked like the happiest couple alive, but inside, I was spiraling. Every time she looked at me, every time she laughed with our guests or held my hand, I wondered what else she might be hiding, what secrets lurked behind that radiant smile. As we danced, Olivia looked up at me with such softness that, for a split second, I wondered if I'd misread everything. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe there really was an innocent explanation for what I'd seen. But just as I was convincing myself to let it go, to give her the benefit of the doubt, she leaned in close and whispered something that froze me in place. "Thank you for being the best part of my life," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. But her next words were barely a whisper, so quiet that only I could hear them. "I don't deserve you." My heart skipped, and I pulled back slightly to look at her, a faint line of worry creasing her brow. She covered it up quickly, smiling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her words had meant something far more than they sounded. The words kept running through my mind, twisting deeper into something darker as we went through the rest of the night. I tried to act normal, but each time she laughed, each time she leaned against me, I couldn't help but see the secret she was trying to hide. And by the end of the reception, I knew that I couldn't ignore it. I needed answers. I kept my arm around her as we made our way to the bridal suite, where we'd finally be alone for the first time since our vows. Inside, she kicked off her shoes and sighed, stretching her arms as she sank onto the bed, her eyes still sparkling from the night's excitement. I sat beside her, watching her for a moment, feeling the weight of everything we hadn't said. "Liv," I began, my voice quiet, "can I ask you something?" She looked up, a slight edge of apprehension in her gaze. "Of course," she replied, a little too quickly. I took a steadying breath, searching for the right words. Is there something you want to tell me? Something you think I need to know?" Her face paled slightly, and her eyes darted away from mine. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. I didn't look away, didn't let her dodge it. You disappeared for a while tonight, and I saw you out by the garden with someone. She froze, her face tightening as her hand flew to her mouth. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the air between us heavy with tension. Then, finally, she looked at me, her eyes wide and glassy with tears. Please, just let me explain, she said, her voice trembling. The room seemed to close in on us as Olivia looked at me, a blend of guilt and panic flooding her eyes. I sat there, hands clenched, waiting for her to say something, anything that would make sense of what I'd seen. She swallowed, looking away, unable to meet my gaze. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's complicated. My mind was spinning, a mix of anger and betrayal tightening in my chest. Complicated? You just promised to spend the rest of your life with me, and you're telling me it's complicated? The words came out harsher than I intended, but I couldn't help it. I felt like the ground was crumbling beneath me. Her shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath, as though she had been holding back something big, something she'd been hiding for too long. It was just a moment, I swear. I never wanted it to get out of hand, she said, twisting her hands together. Out of hand. I repeated, my voice cold. Olivia, what exactly got out of hand? She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were brimming with tears. His name is Daniel, she began, her voice trembling. He was someone I met at work a few months ago. I didn't think much of it at first. He's a consultant, and he was only supposed to be in town for a short time. But then we started talking, and it just escalated. I stared at her, struggling to process her words. This wasn't just some misunderstanding, some drunken mistake. This was a person she'd been seeing, someone she'd allowed into her life, and now, into our wedding. You're telling me this has been going on for months? I asked, my voice barely containing the anger surging inside me. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor, too ashamed to meet my gaze. I never meant for it to get this far. I thought it was just a distraction, something that would end when he left town. But he kept coming back, and, I don't know. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in a long time. I tried to stop it, but you couldn't, I finished, my voice flat. So you brought him to our wedding. While you were making vows to me, he was here too, lurking in the background. Her face crumpled, and she covered her mouth, unable to contain the sob that escaped her. I don't know what's wrong with me, she choked out, tears streaming down her face. I didn't want to hurt you. I love you, but I got caught up in something I couldn't control. Her words made my stomach churn, and I could feel myself teetering on the edge. This was supposed to be the start of our life together, and here we were, not even a few hours after our vows, with a third person already in the mix. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to make her feel the betrayal and hurt that was tearing me apart. But I also felt an odd, hollow emptiness, like my heart had already been ripped out. Did you bring him here tonight? I asked, barely able to get the words out. She shook her head quickly, her eyes wide. No, I swear. He showed up on his own. I didn't even know he'd be here until I saw him during the reception. I tried to tell him to leave, but her voice trailed off, and she looked away, ashamed. He kept saying he needed to see me, that he couldn't handle me marrying someone else. I wanted to laugh, to scream, to shake her and ask her if she even realized the weight of what she was saying. Here I was, her husband, and she was talking about another man's pain as if it mattered. Why didn't you tell me about this before? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I thought I could make it go away, she said, looking at me with pleading eyes. I thought if I could just get through today, then I could leave it behind, and we could start fresh. You have to believe me, I never meant for this to happen. Her words hung in the air, hollow and unconvincing. She was asking for my forgiveness, but it was clear that she had long ago crossed a line that she couldn't come back from. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had just promised my life to, was standing before me as a stranger. I trusted you, I said, my voice raw. All this time, I thought we were building a future together. But you've been lying to me, hiding this, whatever this is. And on our wedding day, Olivia? Did you really think I just never find out? Her eyes filled with desperation, and she reached for my hand. Please, just give me a chance to make this right. I know I messed up, but I don't want to lose you. I love you. I need you. I pulled my hand away, every part of me recoiling from her touch. You don't get to say that to me now, I snapped, unable to contain my anger any longer. Not after everything you've done. She flinched, her face crumbling as she looked at me, pleading silently. But I couldn't bring myself to feel pity or sympathy. Not for her. Not for someone who had shattered my trust in the worst way possible. I stood up, my mind racing. The betrayal, the lies, the twisted game she had been playing. It was too much to process. But one thing was clear. I couldn't just sit here and pretend that everything would be okay. Not now, not ever. I'm leaving, I said, barely recognizing my own voice. I turned and walked toward the door, feeling the weight of her gaze on my back. Please wait, she cried, but I didn't look back. I left the room, leaving her there alone, and as I closed the door behind me, I felt a strange sense of relief, a sense of liberation. I didn't know where I was going or what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I didn't go far. I couldn't. I needed space, but I also needed answers, ones I wasn't sure Olivia would give me. So, I left the suite and wandered through the hotel, finding my way to the bar where a few stragglers from the wedding were still celebrating. I ordered a drink and tried to blend in, all the while running through everything she'd said, picking apart every detail, every slip. And then, as I sat there, numb with disbelief and exhaustion, I noticed him. He was sitting at the far end of the bar, nursing a drink and looking a little too comfortable for someone crashing a wedding uninvited. Daniel. He looked different than I'd imagined. Not some mysterious stranger, but a regular guy, about my age, maybe a little older, dressed well but not overdressed, the kind of guy who wouldn't stand out in a crowd. And yet, he was the one who had managed to shatter the life I'd envisioned with Olivia. Without a second thought, I picked up my drink and walked over to him. He glanced up as I approached, his eyes widening just slightly as he registered who I was. I didn't say anything at first. I wanted him to break the silence, to explain himself, to justify what he'd done, as if that were even possible. Hey, he said, shifting uncomfortably. You must be, yes, I replied curtly, not letting him finish. I am, but I'm curious, who are you? He swallowed, looking down at his drink, probably wondering if he could get away with pretending this was all a misunderstanding. But he must have realized there was no escape because he looked up, meeting my gaze, a mixture of regret and defiance in his eyes. I didn't come here to ruin anything, he said quietly. I needed to see her, to understand why she chose you. I almost laughed, the absurdity of his words grating against my already raw nerves. Why she chose me? We're talking about a woman I just married, and you're sitting here acting like this is some love triangle drama. I don't know what kind of game you think this is, but you don't belong here. He flinched, but he didn't back down. Look, I know how this sounds, and I don't expect you to understand. But Olivia and we connected on a level I've never felt with anyone else. I thought she felt the same way. She made me believe that there was something real between us. Real? I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. And yet she married me. Funny how reality seems to work for you, isn't it? He looked away, his jaw clenching, a faint line of guilt appearing on his face. You don't know what it was like, he said quietly. She was different with me. She wasn't the woman she pretended to be around you. She was the live. Free. Free. I repeated, the word laced with bitterness. Do you even hear yourself? You're talking about my wife. On my wedding night. Have you no sense of shame? He looked down, his face contorted with some combination of guilt and defiance. I could tell he wanted to justify it, to paint himself as a victim of circumstance, as though any of this was beyond his control. But there was something in his gaze, something hollow, that told me he knew he'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. I know I shouldn't be here, he said finally, his voice a whisper. I know I should have left her alone the moment I realized she was with you. But I thought, maybe I could convince her to choose me. I stared at him, my anger boiling over. Choose you? Do you even realize what you're saying? You were a fling, Daniel. A distraction she could drop when things got too complicated. And now, thanks to you, this entire day has been ruined. For a moment, I thought he would argue, that he'd try to convince me he meant something to her. But then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, weary sigh. Maybe you're right, he said softly. Maybe I was just a distraction, but it didn't feel that way to me. The look in his eyes, part shame, part heartbreak, made something in me shift, just a little. It dawned on me that he was, in some twisted way, just as hurt as I was, entangled in Olivia's web of lies and half-truths. He'd been used, too, led to believe he was something more. That thought should have made me feel better, but instead, it made me feel hollow. Look, I said finally, my voice low and steady, you've done enough damage here. The least you can do is leave us alone now. Go back to wherever you came from and let me deal with my wife. He nodded slowly, resignation settling into his features. You're right, he said, standing up and tossing some money on the bar. I'm sorry, man. For whatever it's worth, I'm really sorry. He turned to leave, but as he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. There were too many loose ends, too many questions gnawing at me that I knew only Olivia could answer. The anger that had fueled me was slowly giving way to a cold resolve. I couldn't let her get away with this, not after what she put me through tonight. I returned to the suite, finding her sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of hope and despair. Where were you? She asked, her voice trembling. I was afraid you'd left. I ran into him, I said flatly. She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek as she whispered, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I don't know how I got here. You know exactly how you got here, Olivia, I replied coldly. And now, you're going to explain it to me. No more lies, no more half-truths. I want the whole story, all of it. She took a shaky breath, looking down at her hands, clearly gathering herself for what she was about to say. It started a few months ago, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He was working on a project at my company, and we just clicked. I can't explain it, but he understood me in a way I hadn't felt in so long. I thought it was harmless at first. I thought it was just someone to talk to, but then it became more. I tried to stop it, I really did, but every time I saw him, it just pulled me back in. So you were pulled back in, I said, my voice laced with sarcasm. Just like that. And you thought it was fine to bring him here, to our wedding? She shook her head quickly. I didn't bring him. I swear, I had no idea he'd show up. He texted me when he arrived, and I tried to tell him to leave, but he kept saying he needed to see me. I went out there to talk to him, to tell him goodbye. Goodbye. I laughed bitterly. That's rich. How convenient for you to have closure with your little fling while you're supposed to be committing to me. She looked down, her hands twisting together as she absorbed the weight of my words. I don't know what I was thinking, she admitted, her voice thick with regret. I was selfish. I was wrong. I just didn't want to let go. Let go of what? I asked, frustration boiling over. A fantasy? An illusion? She didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the floor, and I knew she had nothing left to say. The woman I'd thought I knew, the woman I'd pledged my life to just hours ago, was a stranger now, her secrets laid bare. And the life we planned, the future we dreamed of, it all felt like a cruel joke. I stood there in silence, feeling the weight of everything we'd lost, the love that had been tarnished before it even had a chance to begin. The pain, the betrayal, the anger, it all blended together into a cold, unyielding resolve. You have no idea what you've done, I said, my voice low and steady. But you're about to find out. Because this isn't over, Olivia. Not by a long shot. Her eyes filled with fresh tears, but I turned away, leaving her to face the empty silence alone. I spent the next few days avoiding Olivia. Every time I saw her, every time she tried to speak to me, I felt my anger flare, raw and untamed. She called, she texted, but I ignored her messages. How could I even begin to listen to her explanations, her pleas? She'd stolen the life we dreamed of before we'd even lived it. After several days, I reached out to my best friend, Jack. He'd been my rock through everything, and he was the one person I trusted to help me see things clearly. He listened as I told him everything, every sordid detail, every humiliating truth I'd uncovered about my own wife. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. He just sat there, nodding, letting me unravel the weight of it all. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes steely. "So what are you going to do?" I took a deep breath, my resolve hardening. "I'm going to make sure she understands the consequences. I'm not going to let her walk away unscathed." Jack nodded, understanding the weight behind my words. "So, you're going to confront her?" "Yes," I replied, a grim determination filling me, "but not in a way she'll expect." That night, I called Olivia. She answered on the first ring, her voice shaky, nervous. "I was afraid you'd never speak to me again," she whispered, her relief palpable. "Oh, I'll speak to you," I replied, my tone carefully measured. "But only because there are things we need to settle." She was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in her mind. "Can we meet in person? I want to explain everything. I want to make things right." "Fine," I said, my voice cold. "Meet me at the house tomorrow night. And don't be late." I hung up without waiting for a response, feeling a cold satisfaction settle over me. This was it, the moment she would finally feel what it was like to have her world turned upside down. The next evening, I waited at the house, my mind racing with everything I wanted to say. She arrived right on time, looking hesitant and vulnerable, a pale shadow of the confident woman I once thought I'd married. She stepped inside, glancing around as though she expected some kind of trap. "Thank you for giving me a chance to explain," she began, her voice trembling. I held up a hand, silencing her. "Don't thank me yet." She looked down, biting her lip. "I know I've hurt you. I know that what I did was selfish and wrong. But I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I never wanted to lose you." The words felt hollow, empty, like a script she'd rehearsed too many times. But I stayed silent, letting her dig herself deeper into her own lies. "Daniel was just a distraction," she continued, her voice wavering. "I didn't realize what I was doing until it was too late. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm asking for it. I'll do anything to make this right." I stared at her, feeling nothing but a cold detachment. "Anything?" She nodded eagerly, a glimmer of hope sparking in her eyes. "Yes, anything. I want to make this work. I want us to have the life we dreamed of." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Funny you should mention our life. Because it seems to me you already decided what kind of life you wanted when you brought that man to our wedding." She flinched, her eyes filling with fresh tears. "Please, I know it was wrong. I know I betrayed you. But I'm ready to put it behind me. We can start fresh. We can rebuild. Just give me one more chance." I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping me. "Do you think it's that simple, Olivia? That you can just press a reset button after everything you've done?" Her face crumpled, and she looked down, defeated. "I don't know what else to say," she whispered. I don't want to lose you." "Too late," I said coldly. "You already have." For a moment, she looked like she'd break down completely, her shoulders slumping as the reality of my words sank in. But then, something seemed to shift in her, a flicker of defiance in her gaze. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice hardening. "You're just going to throw everything away?" "Me? I didn't throw anything away," I shot back. "You're the one who chose this. You're the one who gambled everything we had for a cheap thrill." She clenched her fists, her voice rising. I was confused. I was going through things you can't even begin to understand. "Oh, I understand perfectly," I replied, my tone sharp. "I understand that you thought you could have it all, a husband, a lover, a fantasy life where you never had to choose. Well, now you're going to see what it feels like to have your world ripped apart." She took a step back, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "What do you mean?" I held her gaze, my voice steady. "I've already started talking to a lawyer." The annulment papers will be ready by the end of the week, and I've made it very clear that I won't be walking away empty-handed. Every expense, every debt we took on together, half of it's yours, and I'm making sure you pay every penny." Her eyes widened in shock. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," I replied. "Consider it a parting gift. You wanted to feel free, right? Well, now you can be as free as you want, without me, and without the life we built together." She opened her mouth to protest, but I silenced her with a glare. "You wanted a fresh start, Olivia? Now you'll get one. Only this time, you'll have to face the consequences of your actions alone." The room fell silent, her defiance crumbling as she absorbed the weight of my words. And in that silence, I saw the reality settle over her, the full impact of what she'd thrown away for the sake of a fleeting thrill. She'd lost me, lost everything we dreamed of, and there was nothing left for her to hold on to. She turned away, tears streaming down her face, and walked out the door without another word. I didn't watch her go. I didn't feel anything at all as I watched the door close behind her, leaving me alone in the empty silence. As I stood there, I felt a strange sense of peace, a calm settling over me that I hadn't felt in days. She was gone, and with her, all the lies and betrayals that had tainted our life together. I'd been wronged, yes, but I was finally free from the weight of her deceit. And as I walked through the house, the empty silence now feeling more like a blessing than a curse, I realized that this was only the beginning. My life was mine again, unburdened by the lies and the pain she'd brought into it. I was free.